As Ukrainian tanks roll into the summer battle, the road ahead is long and winding. No one knows where it will lead. However, experts from the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies have outlined 6 possible scenarios that could unfold with Ukraine's offensive. What are they? Is there a risk of a world war breaking out? At the same time, why is the United States anxious observing the developments of the counteroffensive in Eastern Europe? How dangerous are the political risks for the White House? Join us in today's World Affairs to find out more. Russia's war in Ukraine has been raging on for over a year, and there is still no clear end to the conflict in sight. Thousands of soldiers have died, entire cities have been reduced to piles of rubble. There have been allegations of atrocity by Russian occupiers, and millions have become refugees as Russia has occupied swaths of territory in the south and east of the country. But Ukraine has put up a stronger fight than anyone expected, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in June that his forces had begun their long-anticipated counteroffensive. While it's too early to know whether the counteroffensive will succeed, the direction of the conflict will largely depend on it, Seth Jones, the director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told Insider. With the largest land war in Europe since 1945 now entering a new phase, here are 6 ways it could play out. 1. Ceasefire. The next stage of the conflict will be determined by how quickly or slowly Ukraine is able to retake territory in its counteroffensive, Jones said. If Ukraine stalls, it could raise the prospect of discussions with Russia, he said, which would likely be encouraged by some Western countries. However, if Ukraine were able to reduce the amount of Russian-held territory from the current 20% to around 10 to 15%, it would be less likely to negotiate. Negotiations could lead to a temporary ceasefire, which would end up with a similar situation to the North and South Korean border, where neither side recognizes that the war is over. That would probably not be an end, though. That would be the state of active warfare declining, at least temporarily, and it becomes something closer to a frozen conflict that can heat up or cool down depending on the range of factors, he said. In this scenario, Russia might hope that the US and other Western countries lose interest in the conflict and in supporting Ukraine. That would eventually change the balance of power in Russia's favor and allow it to reconquer territory the way it ideally wanted to in February, Jones said. 2. A peace deal. It is possible the war could end with a peace deal, but Jones said he thought Russian President Vladimir Putin was in too deep at the moment. He's committed far too much political and military capital right now to extract himself from the war without very clear successes, Jones said. While it was not clear what Putin would accept as a success, he might settle for Russia keeping parts of Ukrainian territory it has captured in the east and south, which he could then frame as his intended goal. The more complicated question is what Ukraine would be willing to give up in a deal. Zelensky has said Ukraine's goal is to take back all Russian-occupied parts of the country, including Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. I think that a peace deal is highly unlikely in this climate, and I think it would probably be suicidal for either Putin or Zelensky to make any kind of concession, Jones said. 3. Russian victory. Russia's goal was to fully take control of Ukraine, and Jones said it was important to note that Ukraine had already achieved a significant victory in preventing that from happening. Arguably, at least up to February 2022, the third most powerful military army in the world, behind the US and the Chinese, was the Russians. So they've already prevented a Russian blitzkrieg operation to take the capital, overthrow the government, and either integrate it into Russia or established a puppet government. While Russia's goal looks increasingly unlikely, it may accept a victory in the form of a peace deal that offered more territory than it had before the invasion began. As things currently stand, Russian forces have very little prospect for offensive operations because their casualties in the battle for Bakhmut have been so significant, Jones said. Their goal now will be to solidify territorial gains, prevent Ukrainian forces from liberating additional territory, and then play a waiting game, according to Jones. 4. Russian retreat, Ukrainian victory. It's not out of the question that Ukraine is going to be able to make major advances, but pushing the Russians out of all territory, that's going to be hard. It is possible that Ukraine will be able to make gains in places like Luhansk and Donetsk in the east and Zaporizhia in the south as part of its counteroffensive. And as long as Putin is in charge, it seems very unlikely that Russian forces would retreat entirely. In Russia, bad things happen to rulers who lose wars. Mark Kenson, a retired U.S. Marine colonel and CSIS senior advisor, previously told Insider. But despite Russia's leaders having faced discontent at home due to rising war casualties, the disastrous fate of many conscripts, and an economy damaged by sanctions, he appears to show no signs of backing down. Though the chances of him being overthrown in a coup are perhaps higher than ever, experts have previously told Insider that the Russian leader has made his regime coup-proof. Even if Russia were to suffer major losses in Ukraine, Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and Army Chief Valery Gerasimov would likely be the ones to take the blame, not Putin. 5. Long-term war. One likely possibility is that fighting continues to rage on for months or even years without leaving a clear winner. The conflict could essentially become a war of attrition in which both sides try to wear each other down to the point of collapse. It is unclear which side would be able to hold out for longer. While Ukraine has significant assistance from the West, Russia has more raw manpower and can churn through a lot of bodies, Jones said. However, it is important to note that Russia's military has been significantly weakened by this conflict, having experienced big losses in terms of soldiers and weapons. General Mark Milley, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in May that he thought decades of war was likely, as Russia would struggle to achieve its objectives militarily. However, Russia's manpower means it's unlikely Ukraine will be able to reclaim all of its territory. That means fighting is going to continue. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be hard. And at some point, both sides will either negotiate a settlement or they'll come to a military conclusion, he said. 6. Nuclear war and/or NATO intervention. Putin has repeatedly made nuclear threats since he began the invasion of Ukraine and has claimed it was not a bluff. Western countries and experts are divided on how seriously to take the threats. Jones said that there are big risks involved in using nuclear weapons, including nuclear fallout in Russia's own territory. If Russian forces face a full-scale military rout, Putin could use a battlefield nuclear weapon. But Jones said the risks of it would likely outweigh any benefits. There are a lot of risks involved in making that nuclear taboo politically, diplomatically. What would that spell for Vladimir Putin's regime? I think the US has already communicated pretty forcefully that all bets are off if Russia were to use nuclear weapons, he said. It is unclear whether NATO would get involved in that scenario, Jones added. One senior official previously said that a Russian nuclear strike could trigger a physical response from NATO. However, Jones said that NATO declaring war on Russia could create a major war that could pull in other countries like China, which is an outcome that the organization likely wants to avoid. Instead, NATO would likely first look to increase sanctions and support Ukraine with weapons. Above are the 6 scenarios predicted by analyst Seth Jones that could occur following the Ukraine conflict. They include 1. Ceasefire, 2. Peace agreement, 3. Russian victory, 4. Ukrainian victory, 5. Prolonged attritional warfare, and 6. Russian use of nuclear weapons or NATO intervention. Each scenario carries significant risks and dangers, causing not only Ukraine but also its backers to feel deeply concerned. As Ukraine launches its long-awaited counteroffensive against entrenched Russian occupiers, both Kiev and its backers are hoping for a rapid retaking of strategically significant territory. Anything less will present the United States and its allies with uncomfortable questions they are not yet prepared to answer. With this year's flow of billions of dollars worth of advanced Western weaponry to Ukraine, everybody's hopeful that, you'd see overwhelming success, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin told reporters last week. But he said, adding a note of caution, I think most people have a realistic outlook on this. Western officials claim not to know Ukraine's exact plans. Ideally, Pentagon officials have indicated the Ukrainians will use their newly supplied tanks and training to cut through Russia's land bridge between occupied eastern and southern Ukraine, or take control of the land and sea gateways to the Crimean Peninsula. Such gains could break the current narrative of stalemate and quell any calls for reconsidering current policy. The administration is reluctant to say what would constitute a Ukrainian success against formidable Russian defenses, but the stakes for President Biden are high. As he heads into next year's re-election campaign, Biden needs a major battlefield victory to show that his unqualified support for Ukraine has burnished U.S. global leadership, reinvigorated a strong foreign policy with bipartisan support, and demonstrated prudent use of American military strength abroad. Allies in NATO and beyond have brought heavily into Biden's case. Let no one doubt U.S. leadership and resources are the decisive contribution, visiting British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said Thursday at a news conference in Washington with Biden. Biden, Sunak, and leaders of the more than 50 other countries backing Ukraine have couched their support as part of an apocalyptic battle for the future of democracy and the international rule of law against autocracy, an aggression that the West cannot afford to lose. I asked people to picture what would happen if we were not supporting Ukraine, Biden said, with Sunak at his side last week. Do we think Russia would stop in Kiev? Do you think that's all there would be happening? I think not. China, a Russian partner with its own aims of world dominance, is watching, he and others have warned. In Washington, months of anticipation over Kiev's counteroffensive have overshadowed political criticism from those who say that setting tens of billions of dollars in U.S. assistance to Ukraine has been too much in a time of domestic economic uncertainty. Others argue that slow deliveries and the administration's refusal to supply weapons such as longer-range missiles and fighter jets have not given Ukraine the tools it needs to win. Whether too much or too little, both sides will have rhetorical ammunition if Kiev fails to capture significant territory in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, even the measured pace of supply has severely depleted Allied arsenals, a problem seen as particularly dangerous amid growing Chinese saber-rattling and the possibility that Ukraine's counteroffensive will be less than decisive. Experts and Pentagon officials say support for the war has exposed defense manufacturing delays that are the product of long-ingrained weapons development and acquisition practices, along with the pandemic-exacerbated supply line and workforce deficits. A muddled outcome of limited gains in Ukraine would provide grist for all of those critics and further cloud the already murky waters of NATO and European Union debate over future posture toward both Ukraine and Russia. A less than overwhelming success would probably also increase pressure in the West to push Kiev to negotiate a territorial settlement that may not be to its liking. President Biden and many Western leaders have affirmed the support for Ukraine as long as it takes. But as long as its stakes means different things to different donor governments, US and European officials will find it far easier to continue support at the current level or beyond to reassure domestic public and political opinion, and perhaps even to convince Putin to rethink his goals if Ukrainian advances look like a strong beginning on a possible road toward victory. On the contrary, the atmosphere in Washington and capitals across Europe will be much gloomier if Ukraine's counteroffensive fails. At that point, one question will arise: support as long as necessary, but how far is necessary? Speaking at an economic forum in St. Petersburg, Putin said US President Joe Biden is a grown man and a seasoned politician. It's not for me to tell him what to do. Let him do as he sees fit, and we will do what we believe is in the interest of the Russian Federation and the people of Russia, and everyone will have to reckon with this. According to Politico, the White House is anxiously monitoring Ukraine's counteroffensive, recognizing that not only Ukraine is facing a historic moment, but also President Biden's reputation could be impacted, which will have significant implications for his chances of re-election in 2024. Ukraine and the West have both spent months preparing for the summer conflict in eastern Ukraine. However, it is still uncertain what the actual outcome on the battlefield will be. The situation will become clearer in the coming months, and we will continue to provide updates in future programs. For now, thank you for your attention. Goodbye and see you next time.